Okay, so now we're moving on to our next topic, which is, as indicated in the slide here, militarism, war, and Southeast Asian immigration. And actually, to be more precise, the term Southeast Asian, we're not talking about the entirety of Southeast Asia, like the Philippines, Thailand, so forth. It's actually more specific. It should be more based on what's called Indochina. Okay, so I'm really talking about Indo-Chinese immigration. The reason why Indochina, quote unquote, is somewhat problematic, however, is because it's a colonial sort of construction. Okay, it's a geographical designation based on this colonial imagination. So for now, we'll use Southeast Asian immigration, but I will talk about Indochina soon. Okay, in the next slide actually. But what's going to happen here is, there's this historical backdrop here that's very important, and many of you are aware of this event. It's the Vietnam War. And the United States would become involved in Vietnam and other parts of Southeast Asia, again known as Indochina. And because of our military intervention in this area, it's going to affect a new flow of immigrants coming to the United States. And thus, it's going to change the racial and ethnic complexion of what we call Asian America during the Cold War. Okay. And again, I'm talking about persons from, again, quote, Indochina, unquote. Of course, this includes Vietnamese, but also includes Cambodians, Laotians, and what's called Hmong, Hmong. And in this slide by here, the Hmong are actually pictured down here. I'll talk more about them in a second, but they're, this tribe found in the mountains of Laos. They were very agrarian and actually pre-literate. Okay, they didn't devise, in other words, a system of writing until fairly recently. And they were instrumental in our conflict against the civil war that's happening in Laos. They were on our side. In other words, it's a CIA-backed operation where we sponsored the Hmong tribe to work in intelligence as well as, helping the war effort when we became involved in the Laotian affairs. And by the way, if you were paying attention to the Olympics this past summer, you probably recall the gymnast that won the gold. Um, and she was actually a member of the Hmong community in Minnesota, I believe. Okay, so a lot was made about her family immigrant background. Okay, and here's a picture on the top left of some what's called boat people fleeing from Vietnam to escape the communist regime. This happens around 1975 and continues into the early 1980s. Then here you see a re-education camp, just like a concentration camp where in the country of Cambodia, the communists known as the Khmer Rouge basically put a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people into these concentration camps. And honestly, there was a campaign of extermination. Okay, it was full genocide here that's happening. About 2 million Cambodians died in this genocide. And because of the war and militarism and so forth, it's going to lead to trauma. Okay, a big part of the experience, the immigrant experience of, let's say, the Bow people or the Hmong or the Cambodians coming to the United States by the mid 1970s through the early 1990s. In the backdrop again is this war, which is going to induce a sense of trauma in their lives, and that's going to affect, their ability to settle, to stabilize their lives in the United States, and so on and so forth. Now, as I just mentioned, this is going to happen after 1975. Okay, but that time, by the way, that year is important because that's when North Vietnam officially won the war and created a united Vietnam Republic. And basically, the communist forces won there. So after that, you have the fleeing of thousands, tens of thousands of refugees. Before 1975, in the United States, there was a very small number of persons from what we call Indochina, numbering perhaps to a few hundred. But what we see after 1975 is, let's say by 1980, the figure was around 300,000 persons from Southeast Asia. And then by 2000, you have about a million. And we'll talk about why it rises so much. Okay. And then by 2020, the last census, you see about 1.12 million Vietnamese. You see 320,000 Cambodians. You see 200,000 Laotians and about 180,000 Hmong tribe. By the way, the spelling for that is Hmong, the Hmong people. Okay, so what we have is a recomposition, right, reconfiguration of what is defined as Asian America. Before, let's recall that we talked about some overarching themes that served as structural conditions leading to Asian migration to the United States. One of them, and the first theme, the first structural condition, in other words, was capitalism and how it expanded, both geographically and in terms of, profit, and how that involved labor and therefore race in the country. And I'm sure you recall that because you just took your exam, right? All right. We also talked about another structural background facilitating immigration, and that's U.S. imperialism and overseas colonialism. And this specifically applies, at least before World War II, to the Philippines. And now, after World War II, it applies to, again, Southeast Asians, right? Indo-Chinese, because, our involvement in the Pacific region, the fact that we have this, we see the Pacific region as one of our sphere of influences, right? We have perceived vital interests in that part of the world, and therefore we see U.S. involved in that part of the world. Well, it's going to lead to this migratory flow from that part of the world into the United States. Okay, so um, here are some key terms here that we could look at. I'm not going to define all of these right at this moment. They'll be defined as we discuss this course. But just to begin, okay, we can begin with militarism. And I kind of hinted at this before when I talked about our involvement in the Pacific, right? Basically, militarism, and in this case, we're talking about U.S. militarism. But militarism in general is a belief that strong military action, or even just strong military preparedness, should be fundamental to a nation's foreign policy. It's a belief that you're willing to employ the threat and even the use of military action in order to further one's interest, one's vital interest again in the world. And this is particularly manifested today, even actually. Okay, we have so many U.S. military bases and military installations strewn across the world. Today, the figure is nearly 800 military bases in 80 different countries. That's 2021. And also, we see militarism, U.S. militarism, in the prodigious amount of military spending every year in our annual budget. Okay, despite the fact that we're not actually involved in a war, especially after having left Afghanistan, right? We have this distended budget when it comes to military spending. So those two notions in and of itself, right, suggest U.S. militarism today. But certainly going back into the 20th century, we talked about how in our discussion of imperialism, we had architects of U.S. imperialism looking at the Pacific as our, quote, sphere of influence, all right? We knew the Atlantic was already, not of concern to us. That's the Europeans. The Caribbean, yeah, we'll take some, but again, there's there's European presence there. We're going to look at the Pacific as our sphere of influence, and therefore that's going to lead to war. Okay, how are we going to assert and maintain our presence there? Through, for example, military bases, military presence, and we get lured into war, or you could even argue we precipitate war. Okay, so this is what's going to lead again to this immigrant flow. If you recall the logic that we used when we discuss Filipino American immigration, why did Filipino Americans arrive to the United States, right? Well, it's because the United States went there first. They went to the Philippines first. So the same logic certainly applies here. Why are there Vietnamese, Cambodians, Laotians, so forth in the United States today? Well, it's because the United States went there first, and it's in a form of military intervention. Now, diaspora is the second term here, and basically, diaspora refers to a significant immigration flow uh, away from their home country towards another area of the world. So I say significant. I'm talking about mass dispersion of people, not just individual families, for example. Um, what's an example of this? Well, the Syrian conflict, the Syrian civil war that happened a few years ago, that I'm sure is still happening today in many shapes and form. Well, that led to refugees fleeing Syria and going to all parts of, especially Europe, if you recall. Let's talk about the African diaspora, right? Of African slaves sent to the New World by the 17th century through the 19th century, leading to, in our country, African Americans, right? We could talk about, well, there's what's constantly talked about in the history of Jews is, the Jewish people being part of this diaspora away from their ancestral homeland. But then when you establish the Israeli nation after World War II and the Jews returned to their homeland, you had to kick out the people who were there, and that's the Palestinians, right? You're probably familiar with this conflict, and that resulted in a Palestinian diaspora. Okay, so it's complicated when you think of it that way. Now, we see the next terms there, refugee versus immigrant. Now, immigrant, the way to think about that is when you think about migrants moving from one place, their place of birth, to a place of settlement, a new host country. And it's based mostly on their own decision making, their own free will. And that's opposed to refugees. Refugees, like I said, usually there's a political or an economic context explaining their migration out of their country. And usually it involves diaspora, right? That is to say, significant population number. So refugees, as I just explained, it's not out of their own decision, right? They're in a way forced out of their countries due to political reasons like civil war, political instability, or perhaps even economic reasons like, famine and the possibility of starvation. So you see a mass refugee movement. So that's the difference. And it should be obvious to us that what you're going to see with the example of the Indo-Chinese is them as refugees. And this is in stark contrast to the earlier Asian immigrants, not to mention, European immigrants coming here, where, sure, they're mostly recruited by capitalist, you know, American capitalists or Western capitalists going abroad to seek cheap labor. But, ultimately it's a contract. They sign that contract. Contract presupposes your own decision, free will to sign that contract. Well, they're going there based on their own decision making. Now, what you're going to see, as opposed to that instance where the past Chinese, Japanese, and Filipinos went by their own volition, their own free will. The refugees from Vietnam and Cambodia and so forth, they are basically being dislocated by force, okay, by war, by militarism, by genocide, right, in their own native homeland, and so on and so forth. So this is going to be the big difference when it comes to prior immigrants from Asia, but also, immigrants to come, after the Cold War. And refugees, we're going to see how their particular plight and predicament leads to unique situations, not only in terms of their reception in the United States, but also in their settlement patterns and their ability to assimilate, acculturate, and adapt to American culture. Okay, so now we'll move on to the next slide.